Thank you so much, praise team. We had at our church in Charlotte, there was a guy whose name was Tommy. I really liked Tommy a lot. Among other things, though, he was interesting to me because of what he did. He was a funeral director, and I've always kind of been intrigued by the funeral business, and so I would ask him questions, and he even gave me a behind-the-scenes tour one night that was kind of interesting, and he always had really great stories. And one day I told him, I said, I bet with all of these years of working with families, you've really seen some crazy stuff. I said, what's the most unusual thing that stands out in your mind? He said, years ago, back when we would, for a visitation, instead of having it at the funeral home, we would take the casket with the body out to the deceased person's home, and they would set the casket up in the house, and there would be a wake there in the home. He said in this particular instance, this man had died, and they got the casket, they got the body there to the house, they got it set up in the living room, and the plan was this: they would leave the body there for a few hours, they would come back and pick up the body, take it back to the funeral home so that it would be there for the service the following day. He said, so when he and his partner got there to pick up the body, they went to the casket, but the casket was empty. And they start looking around, and apparently what had happened was this: the widow had her boys get Daddy out of the casket and put him in a chair because that looked more natural. Thanksgiving at that house would have been a ton of fun, wouldn't it? Anyway, something else that was interesting about him, though, too, was that he would moonlight at the medical examiner's office at one of the big hospitals there in town. I said, well, what exactly do you do for them? He said, well, of course, the medical examiner, that individual's a doctor, and he said the doctor will tell me what part of the body he wants me to get for him. He said it could be a section of artery, it could be a heart, it could be a liver, a lung, it could be whatever. And so, that being said, I said, I have heard before that sometimes individuals can have a heart attack that's so massive, even if they had it in the emergency room, there's nothing that anyone could do to save them. I said, what does a heart like that look like? He said, when you take it out, he said, from the exterior, it looks perfectly normal. He said, but then you slice it open. He said, there's 4 chambers inside your heart, but when someone has had a massive heart attack like that, it's just one big chamber. It just looks like a bomb has gone off. He said, so when you see that, you're thinking, okay, I understand now. There's no way that this was a survivable experience. Now, that type of experience that he was describing, though, and in terms of examining a body like that, we know that as an autopsy or a post-mortem examination. So after a person has died, they do this examination on the body, and the reason they do that is because they want to see if they can answer conclusively the question, how did this happen? What is it that brought this about? Outside of that, we can guess, we can postulate, but if we do this, we can answer, hopefully with some measure of real certainty, what it was that brought about this person's demise. This morning, I want you to give some thought to me as we look at a passage that effectively gives us an autopsy. But it's not an autopsy of a deceased person. It's not an autopsy of a dead person. Rather, it is the autopsy of a dead-end decision. There's a choice that the people of God made that was going to be devastating in terms of its consequences. In fact, for many of them, it was going to be a life and death decision. And we look at this as part of our continuing series that we're calling Road Trip, looking at the journey of the people of God as they go from Egypt to the Promised Land. And we're doing this because they were being guided by God as they were walking with God. Now, the specifics of their circumstance are different than ours, but if you're a follower of Christ, you've got to walk with God, and God's guiding you. And it's important for us to pay attention to lessons that are preserved for us so that our walks with God can go much more smoothly. And hopefully it is that we can avoid making some dead-end decisions. We can better prepare for that by seeing this autopsy of how they actually occurred. Look with me in your Bibles today to Numbers. Your bulletin says Numbers 14, but we're actually going to start with chapter 13 because you got to kind of get the context as to what is going on. Numbers 13. And if you would leave your Bibles open, we're going to kind of walk through and drop in a number of places. We don't have time to read 2 whole chapters, but we're going to spend some time in 13 and 14 so that we can see exactly what it is that's going on. Bear in mind now, the children of Israel have been traveling for months. During the day, God would guide them with a cloud. In the night sky, there was some sort of light they could follow if they were to even travel at night. And they have been heading and traveling, not aimlessly, but following the direction of God. And the goal is to arrive at a destination about which God had been telling them for an awfully long time. It was a land of great promise. It was the promise of God to His people. And it was going to be a land that was not just okay or suitable for living, but it was going to be the perfect place. Perfect soil to be able to plant and grow crops, an amazing place to be able to set up homes and businesses and to raise a family. It was going to be ideal among all the places on the face of the earth. This was going to be the promised land of God to His people, and the Lord is leading them towards it. They are now at the doorstep of the promised land, and that's where you find verse 1 of chapter 13. That God tells Moses to send some men to scout out the land of Canaan that I am giving to the Israelites. Again, notice that God is saying, I'm going to give this to you. Send one man who is a leader among them from each of their ancestral tribes. How many tribes are there? There's 12. So that means there's going to be 12 guys that are going to function as spies or scouts. And so they're going to go into this land. And in verse 17, you see the instructions. Moses tells them to go up this way to the Negev, then go into the hill country. See what the land is like, whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. Is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous, bring some fruit from the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. So he's saying, guys, I need you to go in and scout this place out. God's led us here, and before we go into this, we need to know exactly what it is that we are up against, what it is that we're facing. And we've been hearing that this place is really good. Find out if it really is good. Is the land barren, or are there tons of fruits just right there for the picking? So the instruction is for the 12 of these guys to go in and do that. And so they go in. In verse 26, the men come back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness. They brought back a report for them and the whole community and showed them fruit from the land. Hey, look here, I brought some plums. Bought some apples. They didn't bring grapefruit because honestly, if any place has got grapefruit, who wants to live there, right? Anyway. So they bring back some fruit, and they report to Moses in verse 27, we went into the land where you sent us, and indeed it is flowing with milk and honey. So the reports about this place were borne out. It's an amazing place. It's an abundant place. In fact, here is some of its fruit. Verse 28, however, so they start with the positives, and to their credit, that's good. This is a good place. However, the people living in the land are strong. Their cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev. The Hethites, the Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live by the sea. All right, so hearing about all of this, Caleb, who's one of the spies, he quiets the people. Because you can imagine the people are, ooh, 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 ooh. And so he says this, let's go up now and take possession of the land because we can certainly conquer it. That sounds kind of counterintuitive. They're hearing, yeah, it's really nice, but there's cities, big cities, full of big people with big walls. And they probably have big spears and big arrows. Verse 31, but the men who had gone out with him responded, we can't attack the people because they're stronger than we are. As you go to the second half of verse 32, the land we pass through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants. Even the territory is difficult to traverse. And all the people we saw in it are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there. Descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. To us, to ourselves, we seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seen the same to them. So you got the Israelites, everybody's curious. Moses, Aaron, Miriam, everyone is there. They want to hear this report, and man, it starts off really, really good. Man, where God has led us, this promised land, it really is a land of amazing promise. But then they start hearing this report where folks are saying, yeah, but it's guarded, heavily fortified. We can't fight these people. They're so much bigger than we are. I mean, they have entrenched, built-in defenses. There's no way that we can do this. And besides that, these people are huge. I mean, honestly, we're just like little people compared. They are enormous. Chapter 14, verse 1, the whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. So everybody is bemoaning what has been heard. I mean, the episode of Hee Haw is just on track. Gloom, despair, and agony on me. And it's just terrible, or so they think. Verse 2, all the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron. So now they're beginning to grumble about their leadership. Stupid Moses, dumb Aaron. If only we had died back in the land of Egypt. I mean, do you see how bad they view this? I mean, when we were in Egypt, we were slaves. We have no freedom, we have no property, we have squat. It would have been better for us to have died there than to get to this point. Or if only we had died in the wilderness. So in this traveling, maybe we've just passed out from exhaustion and just dropped dead out here in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into the land to die by the sword? I mean, we've come all this way and we've been so excited, so expectant, so longing and looking forward to this great day, only to find out that we're going to head into this place only to be slaughtered. Our wives and children will become plunder, so they will kill all the guys, keep all the wives and children. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? You know, maybe we ought to make a big U-turn. And you know, that brick building wasn't so bad. Brick making wasn't so bad after all. Maybe there's another pyramid they'd like for us to construct. So they said to one another, let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt. Well, they've got a leader, Moses, but we don't need that one because that leader has brought us here. Verse 5, Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole assembly. But verse 6, Joshua, who was one of the spies who scouted out the land, he tore his clothes, which is a sign of his tremendous grief and despondency. He is heartbroken about what he is witnessing from his people. And he said to the entire, verse 7, entire Israelite community, the land we passed through and explored is an extremely good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and He will give it to us. Don't rebel against the Lord. Don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid. But the whole community did what? Threatened to stone them. So what's their verdict? We're not doing this. We're not doing this. And so the people of God at this point say, though it is true that God led us out of Egypt, He liberated us from slavery, though He has miraculously guided us and miraculously provided for our physical needs all along this way, we've gotten here only to be told we ought to go into this land, but there's no way we can do that. We're just going to be slaughtered, and we're not going to do that. We're not going to do this. And so as chapter 14 begins to unfold, you see that Joshua described it correctly, that their refusal to go in and take the land was tantamount to rebellion against God. And so God's response was very clear. Over the next 40 years, all of those people will be wandering around. They will effectively be homeless vagabonds. And during that time, everyone 20 years and younger is going to die. 20 years and over. 20 years and over is going to die. Stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of funerals. None of those people who were gathering rocks to stone Joshua and Caleb, none of those people who were saying, hey, we need a new leader, none of those people who said, wouldn't it be better to be back in Egypt, none of those people were ever going to see the promised land. And not only that, but every single one of them was going to experience an untimely death. They were going to die before they ever should have. Can we say that that's a bad decision? This is a bad choice. In fact, this is a choice of generational consequence, adverse generational consequence. So how do they wind up making it? This passage as it presents us, gives us the post-mortem. It shows us how they made this truly dead-end decision. And why is that important? Because some of you have already made, we have all made to varying degrees, some lousy, bad, dead-end choices, right? If you've lived long enough, you probably have made some of those. But here's the question, do you want to make any more of them? Hopefully the answer to that is no. If you haven't yet made one of those, we can learn from this so that you don't wind up making them. So how did their dead-end decision occur? Well, based on what we see here, the first thing they did is this. They chose to forego long-term gain to avoid short-term difficulty. You will consistently make a dead-end decision when you forego long-term gain to avoid short-term difficulty. What do I mean by that? Let me paint the picture for you. The children of Israel wanted the promised land, didn't they? And in fact, notice again the report in verse 27 of chapter 13. We went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here's some of the fruit. Moses, Aaron, holy cow, this place is so amazing. It is not just a good place, it is the perfect place for us to be able to set up and live and have our families and to generationally occupy and possess this land as an inheritance from God. Man, this is an amazing, wonderful. We want this. We want this. They want it, but it seems that the expectation they have is that it will merely be handed to them. Here's a silver platter. Let's take off the lid. And there's the promised land. But that's not going to happen. That wasn't going to happen. And why wasn't it going to happen? It was not going to occur because the land was not vacant. They're going to have to take it by the exertion of work and force. Now Joshua said to the people that God would deliver this land into their hands because the Lord has removed the protection that the people had. And so Joshua is saying to them, I'm telling you, this is not an impossible task, but we do have to do something. We don't just walk in and all the inhabitants say, it's okay, you can have my house. You want our city? Oh, it's yours. Oh, we just been warming the place for you. That's not going to happen. They're going to have to do something, and there is going to be some pushback. When they discover that there is going to be some pushback, when there's going to be some adversity that they have to contend with, what they decide is this. We would rather forego the long-term blessing of having, in fact, the generational blessing of having possession of the promised land, rather than to face the difficulty of attempting to possess it. There's going to be work, the exertion of force, and we're just not willing to do that. So the choice is we will forego long-term gain so as to avoid short-term difficulty. They weren't going to be perpetually at war. This was not going to be an unending conflict. But there was going to be some difficulty they would have to go through. And they decided, we're not going to do that. There's going to be a little bit of pain, a little bit of adversity, unwilling to experience that. We had a lady at our church in Charlotte whose name was Doris, and she was a sweetheart. She lived with her sister, whose name was Betty, and they had a very meager life, and the only two people, they had a niece, but apart from that, all they had was each other. And they were both, honestly, as sweet as they could possibly be. But one day, unexpectedly, Betty had gotten sick and she died, and that left Doris. And Doris was not in the best of shape at that point to live alone because she had macular degeneration. Some of you know what that's like, or you've witnessed it in the lives of others. And what's going on is that the macula itself in the eye is diseased, and what will happen is that you begin to lose sight from like the center of vision out. And so you get to the point where almost all you have is peripheral vision, and left untreated, if it continues to advance, you wind up going blind. And so Doris had macular degeneration. She'd gone to the eye doctor, she'd gone to the ophthalmologist, and the ophthalmologist said this: we cannot cure this, but there are some treatments that we can do that will, we feel confident, arrest the development of this so that it's not going to get worse. Or at worst case scenario, that we significantly reduce the speed at which it is declining. So they said, hey, we can help you. And there's some stuff that we can do which we are certain is going to provide you some lasting benefit. Here's the catch. How you get that treatment is an injection in your eyeball. I'm not interested, honestly, in getting in the eyeball injection line, right? However, if the choice is get in the eyeball injection line or get in the blind line, I'm thinking, well, give me the shot. Unfortunately, Doris did not make that decision. She just said, there's no way. I can't do, even the very thought of that, I absolutely cannot bear the thought of it. I cannot stomach the prospect of them putting a needle in my eye. Even though the discomfort of that would be just momentary and the benefit of lasting value, I cannot, and I'm not going to do this. Well, unfortunately, her eyesight continued to diminish. Just a couple of years after we came here to Gate City, I'd heard that Doris died. And Doris died in a nursing home completely blind. Could see nothing. Why? Because she decided I would prefer to avoid the short-term difficulty, even if that means foregoing the long-term gain and benefit. Unfortunately, too many times, too many followers of God do essentially the same thing. Let me give you an example. You may oftentimes encounter or have conversations with young people or young adults that are in a stage of life where they're having to make some really important decisions. Among other things, especially as a follower of God, that they could be posed with is this question. Hey, would you like as a single person to wind up being married and having a Christian marriage, one that's going to last, one where the children come to know and walk with the Lord? Many would say, yeah, absolutely, I would love to have that. If given just that blanket hypothetical, they'd say, absolutely, I would love to experience that. The problem, however, is that you do not experience that by accident. You don't get that by dating non-believers. You don't wind up with that when your relationships are characterized with sexual activity outside of marriage. You don't get that when children never ever hear the gospel message and biblical truth at home. You never get that when the church consistently takes the back seat to every other extracurricular activity. And too many times what we see consistently is that people, young and old, are making consistently dead-end decisions because we love the thought of the happily ever ending. We love the thought of lasting benefit and blessing. However, if there's going to be a bump in the road, if there's going to be some work that I have to do, if there's going to be some not so easy decisions that I have to make, if there's some decisions that I have to make that run counter to culture, I'm just not willing to do that. Even if that is for just the short term, there's short-term pushback. So many would say, I'd rather avoid that and completely miss out on long-term gain. This passage breaks down for us how their mistake was made. Maybe already you can look at and evaluate some of the decisions you have in your past that you would say, you know what, that's exactly what happened to me. But there's another thing that you see that characterizes how their decision was made, and that's this. It's very simple. They paid attention to the wrong people. They paid attention to the wrong people. You have this mass of people, the throng of Israelites that everybody is so eager to hear. I don't know how long exactly it was that they were spying out this land, but they're so excited. Everybody to come, man, tell us what happened. What'd you see? I mean, anxious to see what type of fruit. Maybe it was something they'd never seen or tasted before. So anxious to hear if, in fact, this place is bearing out the descriptions that God had provided for them. And so they have 12 spies who go in, and 12 come out and report. All 12 of them start off promising to say, yeah, it's a great, amazing, unusually, uniquely, profoundly good place. Yet 10 of them say it's difficult, perhaps, in fact, not perhaps, but effectively impossible for us to possess this land. two give an entirely different report. Caleb chimes in by saying, hey, let's take it now because we can conquer this. Joshua says, listen, God is going to deliver this into our hands, and He's already removed the protection of the inhabitants of this land. And we should not fear because God is going to give us the ability to devour our enemies. What I want you to understand is this. Between these two reports, they had the right answer. They had the right answer. Their bad, dead-end decision, their woefully regretful choice was not based, and it did not occur out of ignorance. The correct answer, the right path to go, was presented to them. It wasn't by the 10, but it was by the 2, Joshua and Caleb. So how did they still make the bad choice? They paid attention to the wrong people. They paid attention to the wrong people. Well, why did they do that? I think out of the gate, one of the things that you'd have to admit is that they paid attention to the 10 because that's 10 out of 12. I mean, that's not just simply a majority. We're not talking about like 7-5. We're not talking about 8-4. We're talking about 10-2. This is an amazingly, overwhelmingly weighted description. 10 of them are saying we don't have a snowball's chance. So we're going to pay attention to the majority. Let me just say something that you probably already know, and if you don't, get this one in your head. God does not operate by majority rule. He doesn't operate by majority rule. In fact, consistently what you see, not only in the course of biblical history, but a lot of times even in the course of Christian history, and maybe even many instances in your life, the decision that God is in, the choice that God wants individuals to make, the destination that He wants them to arrive at, the choices that He wants you to make or a group to make, oftentimes is the least popular choice. It's the one where oftentimes no one is making that choice. But very easily, and it's part of human nature, but that doesn't excuse us. We just need to be reminded of this fact that we are so easily influenced by seeing where the majority of people are going. And that happens for us in this society and culture, doesn't it? So many of us, even within the church, those that that profess to have personal walks with the Lord and personal connections with God, so many times we are so easily over time influenced in terms of our worldview because there's so many people outside who are headed in a different direction. And it gets old going against the current. It gets old kind of being the Lone Ranger. It gets old not being with the crowd. And at some point, you get tempted, and consistently then, you get tempted to say, well, you know what, maybe I'm just going to kind of go along with them. I mean, can that many people be wrong? Yeah, they can. They can. Remember what Solomon says in Proverbs, there's a way that seems right to the man, but the ways thereof lead unto death. There was an instance with Jesus. Perhaps you remember this. It's in John's Gospel. He had a lot of followers, Jesus did at this point. I'm not just talking about the 12, but I mean, he's become really popular. And Jesus is like a first century rock star because everywhere he goes, thousands and thousands and thousands of people show up to see him. And many of those become kind of like groupies. As Jesus goes from place to place, they're following as well. What's he going to say next? What's he going to do next? I want to be there. I want to see this. I want to experience it. But you get to this pivotal point in John's Gospel where Jesus' message begins to take on a different focus. And he's beginning to talk in suffering servant type of language and about laying his life down as a ransom for many. And all of a sudden, folks are like, I don't know about that. I kind of like the whole conquering king thought. I like the thought of getting rid of Roman oppression. I like all of that, but I don't know what Jesus is talking about. You know, that was kind of fun while it lasted, and what you see is that this massive group of followers begins to drop like flies. And you go from a really, really, really big, enormous throng of people to a comparatively small group of people, to the point where Jesus even looks at the 12 disciples and says, hey, do you want to go away also? And hopefully you remember Peter's response. He said, Jesus, to whom would we go? You have the words of eternal life. But the majority of people were headed in the opposite direction. Was that the wrong way? Absolutely it was the wrong way. In Joshua and Caleb's day, in the days of Moses, the majority was headed in the opposite direction. And that's where the people said, hey, we're going to do that as well, because, that's what the majority says. And so that must be what God wants us to do. Terribly, terribly, drastically bad, dead-end decision. But there's another reason, I think, that they followed the wrong people. Notice the pronouns that they use. In verse 31 of chapter 13, the people say this, the spies, the 10 spies, we can't attack because they are stronger than we are. Look at what Joshua says in verse 8 of chapter 14. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into this land. Don't be afraid of them, for we will devour them. The Lord is with us. Do you see the difference in focus? You had the majority of people, and as they give their report, to what extent is God even part of the equation? Zero. Has that ever happened to you? You've been at a crossroads of decision. Maybe early on in life it was a dating decision, maybe it was a job decision, maybe it was a financial decision. Maybe it's been later in life as you've had to wrestle with how to manage some difficulty in terms of relationships. And interestingly, so many times what we will do as we make those decisions, we don't make them in isolation. We don't make them in a vacuum. We like to talk to people. Hey, what do you think? What would you advise that I do? I mean, and honestly, what we have, compared to any generation before us, the number of therapists and counselors that exist today, that number has exploded. We want to talk to people. We want to hear what they have to say. We want them to weigh in on our circumstance. And so you have the 10 weighing in on the circumstance. And what do they say? Does their language, does their verbiage at all include God at all in the equation? It's all about me. It's all about my limitations. It's all about my obstacles, my enemies. When you compare that to Joshua, what's the focus? The focus is on what God can do. God has let us, He's promised this to us. God has removed their protection. He is going to give us this land. Notice the difference in focus. Your temptation, as is going to be for each of us, and it's not a bad thing. As you make decisions, it's a good thing. In fact, consistently we see, especially in Proverbs, that there's wisdom in the abundance of counselors, and having people that have gone further down the road than we have in particular, to be able to weigh in on some of the circumstances and decisions that we have to make. That's a good thing. The danger is this. You better make sure that those people with whom you are speaking are those where God is absolutely part of the equation. Because when He's not, what you will get is a perspective that has nothing to do with the Lord. And if that happens, if that's the counsel you're getting, what's the likelihood that long term it's going to be for your good? It's not going to happen. They paid attention to the wrong people. The right answer was there, but they paid attention to where the crowds were. They did not pay attention to the focus of the council, whether it was man-based or God-based. And they decided, no, we can't do this. I have been familiar with this passage, have read it who knows how many times over the years. It's one of the biggest events in the Old Testament. This whole experience of getting out of Egypt, getting to the Promised Land, and this is a pivotal decision that they are making. but something I have never noticed before. And even though I've read it, sometimes you read stuff and things don't stick to you. But there was something in preparing for this message that I read, and I'm like, I don't know why I didn't notice this before. Look back at verse 1 of chapter 13. Notice who's talking. It says, the Lord said to Moses, send men to scout out the land of Canaan that I am giving to the Israelites. I've taught this passage before, various points. I'm sure I have preached this passage before. And in my mind, as I remembered the story, Moses decides to send spies in. Because that's what any prudent leader would do. Moses doesn't, and this is foreign territory. He's not ever seen this before. He's completely blind. He don't want to go into possessed land completely blind as to what the circumstances are going to be. Send some folks ahead. That's the prudent, wise thing to do. Scout it out. Spy it out. And for the longest time, in my mind, how I had that ordered is that Moses decided to do this. But that's not the case. This wasn't Moses' idea at all. It was God's idea. God specifically directs Moses, you do this. Send the spies in. Why in the world would God do that? Why would God tell them to send spies in when God knew what was going to happen? God knew what they would see. God knew what they would encounter. The fortified cities, the big dudes, the big weapons, none of that was a surprise to God. He knew about all of that. And yet he told Moses, send 12 guys in and scout out the land, knowing that they would come back with, yeah, it's really nice, but big people, big walls, big fortifications, big weapons. Why in the world would God do that? Wouldn't it have been easier just to keep the cloud by day going and maybe the pillar of fire by night and just kind of let them accidentally stumble onto Jericho and, oh man, we better fight? So that they would almost accidentally stumble into conquering the promised land? But God doesn't do that, does he? He intentionally tells Moses, send spies in, so that Moses and all the people could hear this report. Why in the world would God do that, knowing what they would see? Because of this. I believe sincerely that God was looking to lead a group of people into the land who thought this about God. I need him. We need him. I know my limits, but I know that anything he leads me to do, anywhere he leads me to go, anything he leads me to accomplish, he will make it possible. I believe in Numbers 13, God was looking for that. I believe in 2018, he's still looking for that. Here's the question. Does he see that in you? Will you bow your heads with me? When I talk about dead-end decisions, some of you can say, yeah, I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt.